Ezekiel Barnett rode into the settlement of Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday in April of 1878 with nothing but a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, $32 in his coat pocket, and the specific intention of burying himself so deep in hard work and open land that the memory of Clara Whitmore would finally, mercifully stop breathing inside his chest. He had known Clara for 3 years out of Abilene. She had dark hair and a laugh that carried across a room, and a way of tilting her head when she looked at him that made him feel like the only man standing on 1,000 acres of prairie. He had saved money, bought a ring from a jeweler on the main street, polished his boots until they reflected the lamplight, and ridden to her father's house on a Saturday evening with his heart so full it nearly choked him. Clara had been very kind about it. That was the worst part. She had taken his hand in both of hers and looked at him with genuine sorrow in her eyes, and told him that she was already promised to a banker from Kansas City, that her father had arranged it months before Ezekiel had ever come around, and that she was sorry, truly sorry, and she hoped he would find happiness somewhere. He had ridden away in the dark without saying a single word, and had not stopped riding for 3 days. A man had told him about Caldwell Creek, while Ezekiel was eating salt pork in a roadside trading post somewhere in the middle of the territory. The man said the land west of the creek was opening up, that the Homestead Act was bringing settlers in, that a man who wanted hard ground and clean air and the kind of silence that scrubbed a person out from the inside could find all 3 of those things out there in the rolling grassland below the bluffs. Ezekiel had finished his coffee, paid the man for the information as though it were a commodity, and pointed his horse west. Caldwell Creek itself was not much to speak of in the spring of 1878. It had a general store that smelled of tobacco and dried beans, a livery stable with a weather-beaten sign, a small post office that doubled as the land office, a saloon called the Red Ace where the piano was always slightly out of tune, and a scattered collection of houses and claims that spread outward from the main street like the spokes of a wagon wheel that had been dropped carelessly in the dirt. The surrounding land was grassy and wide, broken by stands of cottonwood near the water and long ridgelines of limestone bluffs that turned golden in the late afternoon light. It was beautiful country, Ezekiel thought. Beautiful and empty, and exactly what he needed. He filed his homestead claim at the land office on that first afternoon, paying the $14 filing fee and marking his name in the ledger in handwriting that was steadier than he felt. The land agent, a compact and businesslike man named Horace Finch, spread a survey map across his desk and showed Ezekiel the parcel that was available. 160 acres on the eastern side of a low ridge, with access to a seasonal stream and decent soil depth based on the survey notes. Ezekiel studied the map and nodded and signed where Finch pointed. "You will be neighbor to the Bancroft claim," Finch said, tapping the map. "The parcel directly to your south. Young woman been working it alone since last autumn. Lost her father to a fever not long after they arrived. She has proven up considerably on her own, which is more than most men manage in the same time. Name is Susan Bancroft." Ezekiel filed the information away without much thought. He thanked Finch, collected his copy of the claim papers, and went to find where he would sleep that first night. He arranged to board at the livery for a few days while he got his land assessed and began planning the construction of a proper shelter. He was thinking about lumber and soil and water tables, and not at all about young women working land alone. He rode out to his claim the following morning just after first light, when the sky was still more gray than blue, and the grass was wet with the kind of heavy dew that belongs only to early spring mornings in the territory. He crossed the low ridge that Finch had described and came down the eastern slope into the broad, open stretch of his parcel, and he sat on his horse at the crest of the rise and looked out over the land that was now, technically and legally, his own, and something in his chest loosened very slightly for the first time in weeks. He dismounted and walked the perimeter of his claim on foot, which took the better part of 2 hours. The soil was indeed good, dark and dense beneath the grass, with the kind of clay content that held moisture without drowning roots. The seasonal stream was running clean and clear with snowmelt, cutting a shallow course through the lower third of the parcel. He noted where he would build, where he would plant, where he would eventually put up a barn when he had the means for it. His mind was moving purposefully, practically, and he was grateful for it. It was on his return, along the southern boundary of his claim, that he saw her. She was on the other side of the low fence line that marked the boundary between his parcel and the one to the south, and she was doing something extremely practical and unromantic with a fence post and a post hole digger, working with the focused, economical effort of someone who had long since stopped performing labor and had simply become it. She had light brown hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was wearing a practical work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and leather gloves on her hands, and she was so thoroughly concentrated on what she was doing that she did not notice him at all for several seconds. Ezekiel stopped walking. He was not sure why exactly. He was simply stopped. Then she looked up, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with a straight, honest face and hazel eyes that caught the morning light in a way that was distracting, and a mouth that held itself in a firm line that suggested she was accustomed to not wasting expressions on things that did not warrant them. She looked at him with neither alarm nor particular welcome, simply the steady, assessing look of someone evaluating a new variable in their day. "You would be the one who took the Hendricks parcel," she said. It was not a question. "Ezekiel Barnett," he said, "just filed yesterday." "Susan Bancroft," she said, and she returned her attention to the fence post. He stood there for another moment, feeling faintly ridiculous. "That post giving you trouble?" he asked. "It was," she said. "It is not any more." She set the post hole digger aside and picked up the post itself, dropped it into the hole with practiced efficiency, and began tamping the earth around it with her boot. "I could help," he said, because it was the right thing to say and because he had nothing else pressing in that particular moment. Susan Bancroft looked at him again with those measuring hazel eyes. "Can you tamp a post?" "I can." "Then come around to the gate," she said, pointing down the fence line to where a simple wooden gate stood 20 yards away. He went around to the gate and came through and helped her tamp the post, and they did not say much while they worked because the work did not require much saying. When it was done, she pulled off her glove and tested the post with both hands, and it held solid, and she gave a brief nod of satisfaction that seemed directed more at the post than at him. "Thank you," she said. "I expect you need to be getting on with your own parcel." "I expect so," he said. "Good morning, Miss Bancroft." "Good morning, Mr. Barnett," she said, and put her glove back on and picked up the post hole digger and moved on to the next spot she had marked. He went back through the gate and spent the rest of the morning walking his own land and thinking about practically nothing except fence lines and soil composition, which was precisely as it should be. Over the following 2 weeks, Ezekiel threw himself into the work of establishing his claim with a ferocity that would have alarmed anyone who had known him before Abilene. He hauled lumber from the mill in Caldwell Creek on a borrowed wagon, negotiating the price with the mill owner, a big Norwegian named Sorensen, in the blunt way that 2 men who respected each other's time conduct business. He set his foundation stones, framed his walls, cut his window openings. He worked from before sunrise to after sunset and fell onto his bedroll each night with the specific bodily exhaustion that is the only reliable cure for a mind that otherwise will not stop moving. He encountered Susan Bancroft regularly because their land shared that long southern fence line, and because the nature of frontier homesteading meant that both of them were almost constantly outdoors. He would see her working her kitchen garden, which was already established and impressively organized in the way that only someone who had been working it through the previous fall and spring could achieve. He would see her bringing in her small string of horses, 3 solid-looking animals that she managed with quiet competence, or riding out across her land checking her fencing or her grazing. They would exchange nods, brief words, occasionally a practical observation about the weather or the state of the creek. He learned things about her slowly, the way you learn about a landscape by crossing it repeatedly at different times of day. He learned that she had come out from Missouri with her father, Robert Bancroft, the previous summer, that Robert had died of typhoid in October, and she had simply kept going because there was no practical alternative. He learned that she had a younger sister named Clara somewhere back east, which produced in him a brief and irrational lurching sensation when he heard the name, though of course it meant nothing. He learned that she had gone to a school in Missouri until she was 16, that she could read well and had an opinion about books, that she had learned to handle a rifle from her father and was accurate with it, and that she did not complain about anything, not the work, not the isolation, not the loss of her father, not the considerable difficulty of being a young woman alone on a homestead claim in 1878 Kansas territory. That last thing he did not simply learn from observation. He had to be honest with himself about it. He had gone looking for it, in the gradual, half-acknowledged way that a man begins paying more attention to a particular landscape because something about it draws him. It was on a Wednesday evening near the end of April that the acquaintance shifted into something different. Ezekiel had spent the day cutting and stacking sod for an interim shelter that would serve while the proper frame house was being built, because a spring storm was coming in from the northwest, and he was not going to be caught without proper walls when it arrived. He had just come inside and lit his lamp when he heard the knock at his door, which surprised him considerably, because he had not yet had a single visitor to the claim. Susan Bancroft stood in the doorway in the blue-gray light of the approaching storm. She had a covered pot in her hands and she looked, for the first time since he had met her, slightly uncertain, as though she had decided to do this thing and was committed to it but had not quite anticipated the particular social geometry of standing on someone's doorstep holding a pot of food. "I made more stew than I can eat," she said. "Beef and vegetables. It seemed wasteful to let it go." He looked at her and at the pot and at the sky behind her that was turning the specific green-gray color that meant serious weather. "You should come inside," he said. "That storm will be on us in 20 minutes. She looked at the sky, made the same calculation he had made, and came in. They ate the stew at the rough plank table he had built 2 days before, with the wind starting to push against the walls and the rain beginning to knock at the single window. The stew was extraordinarily good, rich and seasoned, and Ezekiel said so without embellishment, and Susan acknowledged this without false modesty because she knew it was true and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "You have made good progress on the house," she said, looking at the framing above them. "Slower than I'd like," he said. "But it will stand." "It will," she agreed, examining the joinery at the nearest wall with the eye of someone who understood structural work. "Where did you learn to build?" "My father had a farm in Ohio," he said. "He believed a man should be able to do every part of the thing himself before he hired anyone to help with it." "That is a good principle," she said. "My father was the same, though my father's execution of it was sometimes more enthusiastic than precise." She said this with a dry affection that contained a whole private history. "Was he a good man?" Ezekiel asked. She was quiet for a moment, and the storm pushed hard against the walls and the lamp flame swayed. "He was the best man I knew," she said. "He was also not practical in the way that the territory required. He came out here because he needed a new start and because he had read too many pamphlets put out by the railroad companies about the richness of the land and the ease of the opportunity." She paused. "The land is rich, the opportunity is real, but the pamphlets left out a great deal about what a new start actually costs a person." "They always do," Ezekiel said. She looked at him directly. "And what about you, Mr. Barnett? What brings you to Caldwell Creek?" He had been expecting the question and had prepared a sufficient answer. "Wanted land of my own," he said. "Abilene was becoming crowded." She considered him with those hazel eyes for a moment and then said, "That is true as far as it goes," in a tone that suggested she was filing the rest of the question away for another time. The storm raged for the better part of 3 hours, and Susan stayed because leaving in the middle of it would have been irrational, and they talked. They talked about Missouri and Ohio and the territory. They talked about what she planned to plant that season and what his strategy was for the first year of his claim. They talked about books, and he was surprised to discover that she had brought 3 of them in her wagon from Missouri and could discuss them with the same practical directness she brought to everything else. She lent him one before she left, when the storm had eased to a drizzle and the air smelled of wet grass and ozone, handing it to him at the door with the same matter-of-fact efficiency with which she had handed him the stew pot. He stood in the doorway and watched her walk back south through the wet dark toward her own house, and he stood there for probably a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he went back inside. The book was a collection of essays by someone he had not read before, and he read 30 pages of it before he fell asleep that night and thought about the way she had said his father was the best man she knew, and the particular quality of privacy and precision in everything she said. He did not think about Clara Whitmore at all. He noticed this the next morning, and it startled him enough that he stood over his coffee for a full minute with the cup halfway to his mouth, taking stock of the fact. Spring moved into its fullest expression across the territory, and Caldwell Creek grew incrementally busier, with the arrival of new settlers following the trails of rumor and railroad pamphlet advertisement, just as Susan's father had done. Ezekiel watched these arrivals from a settled vantage point now, having been there long enough to have a recognized place in the community. He had finished the main room and loft of his frame house by the second week of May and had moved in properly, and the sense of having a structure behind him, something he had built with his own hands from the raw material of the land, produced in him a deep satisfaction that he had not expected. He became a recognizable presence in Caldwell Creek itself, going into town once or twice a week for supplies and mail, and the particular social functioning of a small frontier settlement. He drank occasionally at the Red Ace, played cards sometimes with fair skill and no particular passion for it, and built the kind of easy-working friendships with other men on nearby claims that frontier living required. There was Tom Haskett, 2 claims to the north, a big, easy-going Kentuckian who laughed constantly and seemed to find something genuinely funny in every situation life produced. There was the Delacroix family to the west, French Canadians who had come down from the Northern Territories, with 4 children who ran freely across their land like a small private weather system. There was the Reverend Amos Caldwell, no relation to the Creek, who held Sunday services in the general store until a proper church could be built, and who had the quality of a man who was genuinely curious about human nature rather than merely judgmental of it. It was through Reverend Caldwell, actually, that Ezekiel learned something that clarified the quiet, weighted quality he sometimes sensed in Susan. He had stopped at the Reverend's house, a modest but well-maintained structure near the edge of town, to return a harness that Caldwell had lent him for the week, and the Reverend had invited him in for coffee and had talked, in his roundabout way, about the settlement and its people, and the specific courage it took to hold claim to a piece of ground in the territory when you were alone. Miss Bancroft is one of the finest examples of human fortitude I have encountered in 30 years of ministry, the Reverend said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has taken careful measure of many people. And I say that knowing that fortitude without proper support becomes isolation, and isolation has its own cost. She seems self-sufficient, Ezekiel said carefully. She is magnificently self-sufficient, said the Reverend. That is precisely what concerns me about her. The magnificent ones are the last to ask for anything. Ezekiel thought about this riding home. He thought about the book she had lent him that first stormy evening, the stew she had brought to his door, the way she asked clear questions and listened to the answers with real attention, the way she stood at her fence line looking out across her land in the early morning sometimes, before work, with an expression he had only glimpsed from a distance that seemed to contain something very large and very quiet. He returned her book the following afternoon, walking it down to the gate in the fence line, and finding her in her kitchen garden staking tomato plants with strips of cloth. She looked up when she heard the gate, and he held up the book, and she smiled, which was not something she did casually, and the smile changed the whole architecture of her face in a way that lodged in his chest and stayed there. "Did you read all of it?" she asked. "Every word," he said. "I have opinions about the third essay." "Come in and tell me about them," she said, gesturing toward the house with her staking stick. "I have coffee on." He came in and they talked about the essay, which concerned itself with the nature of self-reliance and its limits, and the conversation moved from the essay into a wider discussion of the particular human problem of asking for help when you need it, and Susan spoke about this with a forthright honesty that suggested she was aware of what she was actually talking about and did not feel the need to obscure it. "My sister writes to me," Susan said at one point, pouring his second cup. "She is still in Missouri, working as a school teacher. She wants me to come home. She says the territory is no place for a woman alone." She set the coffee pot down and considered the table for a moment. "I think she means it kindly, but she says it as though the fact of my being alone is the problem rather than a circumstance, as though leaving would solve something rather than simply moving the problem to a different location." "Your sister," Ezekiel said carefully. "What is her name?" "Clara," Susan said. The name moved through him like a stone dropping into still water, and he was glad he was looking at his coffee cup and not at her face in that moment, because he was not sure what expression he was wearing. He let the silence extend for 2 seconds, 3, and then looked up with what he hoped was a neutral expression. "Clara," he repeated. Susan was watching him. She was always watching, he had come to understand. She missed very little. "Do you know a Clara?" she asked. He considered lying by omission and then decided against it because it seemed like a very bad way to begin anything. "I knew a Clara in Abilene," he said. "Not well. It was some time ago." Susan's hazel eyes rested on him with a quality of waiting, and he understood that she was offering him the space to say more if he chose to, and that she would not press him either way. "She is the reason I am in Caldwell Creek," he said, because he had not said it out loud to anyone, and found suddenly that the specific weight of an unspoken thing is sometimes lifted by the saying of it. "Not her exactly. The end of something I had hoped for. I wanted to be somewhere far enough away from Abilene that I stopped expecting to see her face around corners." He had not intended to say quite that much and looked at his coffee cup again immediately after. "Has it worked?" Susan asked, and her voice was perfectly level, without any edge of judgment or particular emotion, just the clean question. He thought about it honestly. "More than I expected," he said. "The land helps." "The work helps." "They do," she said simply, and refilled his cup, and changed the subject to the state of his eastern fence line, which needed attention, and he was grateful for the clean, practical turn of it. He walked home in the late afternoon light thinking about Clara Whitmore and Clara Bancroft, and the extraordinary small cruelty of coincident names, and about the particular quality of Susan's question and the honest way she had asked it. He thought about the Reverend's words about the magnificent ones being the last to ask for anything. He thought about the essay on self-reliance and its limits. He thought about Susan Bancroft's smile. By June the territory had settled into full summer heat, the kind that pressed down on the grassland like a hand and turned the sky above the bluffs a deep, intense blue. Ezekiel had his kitchen garden established, and his first fields broken and planted with winter wheat and some experimental corn that Tom Haskett had talked him into. And the work of the summer was the ongoing, daily, minutely managed work of keeping everything alive in the heat. He checked his water supply daily, maintained his irrigation where he had it, rode his fence lines every few days to check for damage from the pronghorn antelope that moved through the area in loose, agile groups. He and Susan had fallen into a pattern that had not been formally agreed upon, but had established itself with the naturalness of water finding a channel. 2 or 3 times a week one of them would find a reason to cross through the gate in the fence line, whether it was to return a borrowed tool, share surplus from the kitchen garden, consult about a practical problem, or simply because one of them had made too much coffee and the other was there. They talked about everything, and nothing with a quality of easy, wide-open engagement that Ezekiel had not felt in conversation with another person in longer than he could precisely identify. She was funny, which surprised him initially because her default mode was so direct and economical. But she had a dry, precise wit that appeared without warning in the middle of otherwise serious conversations, and produced in him a laughter that felt like something physical being released from his chest. She made observations about the specific absurdities of frontier life with the deadpan accuracy of someone who had cataloged all of them with full awareness and had made the decision to find them funny rather than despairing. And this choice, which he could tell was genuinely a choice she had made, seemed to him one of the bravest things about her. He had begun to understand that there were many brave things about her, and that they were all connected. In the second week of June, she came to him with a practical problem. One of her horses, a sturdy bay mare named Clover, had developed a persistent lameness in her left foreleg that Susan had been managing with poultices and rest, but which was not improving the way it should. Ezekiel knew horses well, which was not uncommon for a man who had spent years moving across the territory, and he came to look at the mare and found a small abscess in the hoof that needed to be properly drained and packed. He dealt with it carefully and competently while Susan held the mare's head and talked to her in a low, continuous murmur that kept the animal calm throughout the process. Afterward, they sat on the fence rail watching Clover move cautiously around the small paddock, already looking more comfortable, and Susan said quietly, "Thank you, I was worried about her." "She will be fine," he said. "Give it a week and she will be back to full work." "I know," Susan said. "I knew you would know what to do. I have been watching you with your animals." He looked at her. She was looking at Clover, not at him, her forearms resting on the top rail of the fence, her hat pushed back slightly on her head in the way she wore it when she was not actively in the sun. "I have been watching you too," he said, and was not entirely sure whether he meant the horses or something else. She turned and looked at him with those level hazel eyes, and the afternoon light was doing something to her face that was difficult to look at directly. "I know," she said, and then, with the particular courage of someone who does not take many unnecessary risks and so makes each one count, she said, "I do not mind it." He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, and she held his gaze steadily, and the summer air between them was very warm and very still. "Good," he said. It was not eloquent, but it was completely true. She looked back at Clover, and he looked at Clover, and they sat on the fence rail for another while in the particular rich silence of two people who have just said something significant without raising their voices. That night, he lay in his loft looking at the ceiling of his new house and listening to the warm Kansas night, and thought about Clara Whitmore for the first time in weeks, not with the old ache, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. He thought about how Clara had been lovely and genuinely sorry, and completely right that they were wrong for each other in every way that mattered, and how he had been too raw and too young in his pride to see it then, and how he could see it now from the useful distance of a changed country and a changed season. He thought about Susan Bancroft, who was none of those things, who was instead sharp and funny and kind and unsentimental about kindness, who was building something real on real ground and doing it with a quality of intention that he recognized, because he was trying to build something with the same quality of intention, and who had sat on a fence rail in the golden light of a June afternoon and told him she did not mind being watched. He smiled at the ceiling of his house and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was the opposite of hollow. July brought heat that was almost aggressive in its intensity, and with it came a letter for Susan that she mentioned to Ezekiel one morning over the fence line with an expression that was carefully neutral in the specific way she was carefully neutral about things that were not entirely neutral. "My sister writes that she is thinking of coming west to visit," Susan said. "She is not sure of the timing, perhaps autumn." "That would be good for you," Ezekiel said, "to have family here." "Yes," Susan said, and then added, "Clara can be somewhat determined in her opinions about what is best for people." "Older or younger?" he asked. "Younger by 2 years," Susan said. "She is 21. She has always been quite certain about things." He nodded, and they moved on to talking about his corn, which was doing better than Tom Haskett's corn but not as well as the Delacroix corn, and the sister was not mentioned again that day. But Ezekiel thought about it later. He thought about the fact that the Clara Whitmore of Abilene and the Clara Bancroft of Missouri shared not only a name, but apparently a tendency toward determined opinions about what was best for people. And the coincidence felt like something that the universe had arranged for its own private amusement. And the fact that he could think about it with mild irony, rather than pain, seemed to him like good evidence about where he currently stood. He was falling in love with Susan Bancroft, and he had been aware of it for some time, and had been watching the awareness the way you watch a fire you have built on the open prairie, with attention and respect, and a clear-eyed understanding of what it is. The question was what to do with it, and the answer, he was increasingly certain, required saying something, and saying it in a way that was worthy of her, which meant it had to be direct and honest and not dressed up in anything that it was not. He had been working toward this gathering of courage for about 2 weeks when the event that changed the shape of everything happened, which was characteristic of the territory, in his brief experience of it, that things moved on their own timeline regardless of yours. He was at the Red Ace on a Friday evening in late July, having gone into Caldwell Creek for supplies and stayed for supper at the hotel dining room, and then stopped into the saloon for a single drink, as was occasionally his habit. He was at the bar talking with the bartender, a knowledgeable man named Gus who served as the informal town newspaper, when 2 men came in whose quality he clocked immediately with the instinct that years of moving through rough country develops. They were not settlers. They had the looser, more watchful manner of men without fixed addresses, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from being accustomed to getting what they want through methods that are not primarily polite. He kept his attention on his glass and listened while they talked to each other in the casual, slightly too loud way of men who want to be heard. And what he heard was a conversation about the Bancroft claim, specifically about the fact that there was a woman working it alone, that her father was dead, that she had no man attached to the place, and that the land was good with a reliable water access that someone with different intentions than Susan's could make use of quite profitably. He left his drink on the bar untouched, paid Gus, and rode home in the dark at a pace that was faster than casual. He was not panicked precisely, because panic was not useful. But he was alert and moving with purpose, and when he came to the gate in the fence line between his land and Susan's, he went through it without hesitation and knocked on her door, and she opened it with a lamp in her hand, already awake, wearing a sensible wool dressing gown and with her hair down around her shoulders, and she looked at him with immediate, steady assessment. "What happened?" she said. He told her what he had heard, directly and without embellishment, and watched her face process it with the calm efficiency that was one of her most consistent qualities. She did not perform alarm, but he could see that she was taking it seriously, which was the right response. "I know who they are," she said, "or the type anyway. There have been land disputes in the area. Haskett told me about trouble over near the Westcott claim last season." "Do you have your rifle?" he asked. "Always," she said, "and I know how to use it." "I know you do," he said, "but 2 men are 2 men. You should not be alone out here tonight." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment and then said, "You could stay. There is a spare room." She said it with perfect practicality, but her eyes were doing something that was not purely practical, and he understood that she was also aware of what she was saying. "I will stay," he said. He slept in the spare room and nothing happened. And in the morning the land was quiet and golden, and the mare Clover was fine in her paddock, and Susan made breakfast with the competent efficiency of a woman who knows her own kitchen thoroughly. And they sat across the table from each other in the early light and ate, and talked about nothing in particular with the specific ease of people who have spent the night in the same house for the first time, and discovered that it fits. He rode into Caldwell Creek that morning and had a conversation with the local marshal, a weathered and sufficiently capable man named James Dell, who took the information about the men at the Red Ace seriously and said he would look into it. Dell did look into it, and within a week, the two men had moved on from the area by means of a conversation with Dell that Dell described only as conclusive. Susan's land was undisturbed. But something had shifted in the night he had spent at her house. Some fundamental arrangement between them had moved into a new position, and they were both aware of it in the way that two people aware of a change in weather are both aware of the change. It was a Sunday afternoon in August, the light coming in long and amber across the grassland, when Ezekiel crossed through the gate in the fence line carrying a purpose as deliberately as a man carries water in an open container, careful not to spill it before he gets where he is going. Susan was on her porch in the late light, mending something with the calm industriousness that characterized her resting state, and she looked up when she heard his boots on the path and set the mending in her lap and waited. He sat down on the porch step, which was where he usually sat when they talked in the afternoons, and he turned his hat in his hands for a moment and then set it on the step beside him and looked at her directly. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I came to Caldwell Creek to forget a woman in Abilene," he said, keeping it clear and honest. "That is the true reason I am here, and I told you a part of it once and I want to tell you the rest of it now. I came here because I had expected something from my life in Abilene that did not come about, and I was running from the absence of it. I rode west looking for nothing in particular except enough space and enough work to stop feeling that absence." She was watching him with very still attention. "And then I found this land," he said, "and I found this place, and I found the person who lives on the land next to mine." He looked at her steadily. "And I want you to know, Susan, that I am not carrying that absence anymore. I have not been carrying it for some time. Whatever I came here to outrun, I have outrun it, and what I have found in its place is something I did not expect and do not want to lose." The amber light was very quiet on the porch. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass below the ridge. "You are telling me," she said, and her voice was careful but not closed, "that you have feelings for me." "Yes," he said. "I am telling you that clearly because you deserve clarity and because I would not do you the discourtesy of being oblique about something this significant." She looked at him for a long time and he held the look steadily, letting her take whatever measure she needed. Then she set her mending on the porch railing and folded her hands in her lap and said, "I have been aware of my own feelings for you for longer than is probably dignified to admit." Something opened in his chest like a door opening into light. "I want to know," she said, "whether what you are proposing is a friendship with feelings in it or something more serious than that." "Something considerably more serious," he said. "Good," she said, with a smile that was the fullest smile he had ever seen from her, the one that changed the whole architecture of her face. "Because I am a serious person and I would not know what to do with less than that." He reached across the step and took her hand, which was warm and capable and real in his, and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and the light was making everything very clear and very golden and very true. "May I court you properly?" he asked. "You may," she said. They sat on the porch until the light went to dusk and the stars came out over the bluffs, talking with the particular unhurried quality of people who understand that they are at the beginning of something and that the beginning is worth inhabiting fully. He walked back to his own house in the dark with his heart conducting itself in an undignified manner that he found he did not mind at all. The courting that followed was conducted in the way of people who already know each other well enough to skip certain formalities and get directly to the substance. It was the daily work of two lives being woven together in practical and emotional terms simultaneously. He brought her things she needed, not as a performance of provision, but as the genuine expression of attention to what was useful. She brought him things he needed in return, with the same practical directness, and the exchange felt like the honest beginning of a real partnership. He accompanied her to Sunday services at the general store and sat beside her in the way that marked a couple in a small community with the efficiency of a public declaration, which he had done consciously because he wanted it to be known that she was not alone and had not been for some time. Reverend Caldwell shook his hand afterward with a warm firmness that communicated a good deal without any words. Tom Haskett slapped him on the back with enough enthusiasm to dislodge a lung and said, "About time, Barnett. I have been watching you two orbit each other for 3 months, and I nearly said something myself except it was none of my business." "It was not," Ezekiel agreed pleasantly. "She is the finest woman in the territory," Tom said, "and I say that as a man who is himself not available because my wife would hear of it." "She is the finest woman I have ever known," Ezekiel said, and meant it completely. And the fact that he had said something very similar once about a different woman in a different town seemed very long ago and very accurately described as an education rather than a loss. August turned to September with the particular drama of a prairie autumn, the light changing angle and color, the grass going golden and then amber, and then the deep tawny brown of late season, the air acquiring an edge that was clean and cold at the edges of the day. The work of harvest filled every waking hour, and Ezekiel and Susan worked their harvests in coordination that made both more efficient, helping each other with the tasks that were difficult to manage alone, which were numerous. It was in the second week of September that the letter came. Susan told him about it at the fence line one morning with an expression that combined genuine pleasure and a visible low-level apprehension that she was managing with her characteristic competence. Clara was coming. She had decided on a date and purchased a stage ticket and would arrive in Caldwell Creek in 3 weeks. "I am glad," Susan said. "I have missed her. We were very close growing up. She is good company and she is genuinely kind, but she can be determined," Ezekiel supplied. "Determined," Susan agreed, "and she will have opinions about the territory and about the claim and about the life I have built here. She will express these opinions in a thorough way. And about me," Ezekiel said. Susan looked at him with a slight smile. "She will examine you very carefully," she said. "She is protective of me in the way that younger sisters sometimes are more protective of older ones than the older one is of herself." "I can manage an examination," he said. "I believe you can," she said. "I simply wanted you to know what was coming." He appreciated the warning, and he thought about the name, Clara, and the entire complicated small history attached to it, and decided well ahead of the stage's arrival that he was going to introduce himself to Clara Bancroft, as though the name meant exactly nothing beyond her name. Because it did, in fact, mean exactly nothing now, and the business of a different Clara in a different town was a matter settled entirely in his own interior, and had no business being anyone else's story. Clara Bancroft arrived on the first Tuesday of October on the morning stage, and Ezekiel drove Susan to town to meet it in his wagon because he had a team and Susan had only horses, and there was luggage to consider. Clara Bancroft was 21 years old and shorter than her sister, and had dark hair where Susan's was light, and the specific quality of energy about her that Susan had described as determined, which manifested itself in the first 5 minutes of acquaintance as a kind of comprehensive alert attention to everything around her, as though she were taking simultaneous inventory of the stage depot, the main street of Caldwell Creek, her sister's general appearance and emotional state, and Ezekiel himself, all at once, and organizing the information with considerable efficiency. She embraced Susan with a genuine warmth that had real duration and then stepped back and held her sister by the shoulders and looked at her with searching eyes and said, "You look well. You look better than well, actually. You look." She paused, studying Susan's face with the precision of someone who has known it for 21 years. "You look like yourself, but with more in it." Susan looked briefly at Ezekiel with a slight amusement and then said, "Clara, this is Ezekiel Barnett. He has the claim to the north of mine." Clara turned and gave him the same comprehensive attention she had been directing at the town. She was bright-eyed and composed and looked at him with the frank directness of a woman who does not see the social utility of being indirect when direct is available. "Mr. Barnett," she said, extending her hand in a way that was both entirely proper and slightly challenging, "Susan has written about you." "Miss Bancroft," he said, shaking it, "I hope the letters have been accurate." "They have been careful," Clara said, and glanced at her sister with a very small smile, and Susan sighed faintly in the particular way of a person who knows their sibling extremely well. They loaded Clara's trunk into the wagon and drove back to Susan's claim in the bright October morning, with Clara asking questions at a productive rate that covered the territory, the settlement, the claim, the winter preparations, and the general social landscape of Caldwell Creek. She asked good questions. He could see where Susan's intellectual precision had come from. It was a family quality, though in Clara it expressed itself with more velocity. He helped carry the trunk inside and stayed for coffee, and then excused himself to his own work. And as he came through the gate in the fence line, he heard the conversation begin behind him at a volume and a pace that suggested it would be a long afternoon. The following days brought an interesting dynamic to the fence line. Clara was helpful in a way that could not be faulted, rolling up her sleeves and working alongside Susan with the competence of someone who had also been raised to do for herself. And she was also invariably present when Ezekiel came through the gate or appeared at the fence line, studying the interactions between him and her sister with the interested attention of a scientist observing a phenomenon. She was not hostile, which was important. She was simply watching. And Ezekiel, who had been watched closely by Susan for months, and had come to understand that being watched carefully by the Bancroft women was a form of respect rather than suspicion, met Clara's observation with the same patience and openness he had learned to bring to Susan's. On the third evening after her arrival, Clara came through the gate herself, alone, and found him at his woodpile splitting wood for the winter and said, "May I talk with you?" He set the maul down and offered her the section of log he used as a sitting block and took the fence rail for himself. "You may," he said. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and said, without preamble, "Susan has not been happy for a long time. She has been strong, which is different. She has done everything right and she has not asked for help and she has not complained, and I have been 3 states away watching it in her letters and being frightened for her because strong alone is a particular kind of loneliness." He said nothing, because this was exactly right and she did not need him to confirm it. "And now she is happy," Clara said. "I can see it. It is in her face and in the way she moves and in what she does not say as much as what she does. And you are the cause of it, and I want to know if you understand what that means. Not the surface of it, the actual weight of it." He looked at her directly. "I understand it," he said, "and I want you to know that I intend to make sure she continues to be happy, not as a project or a responsibility, but because she is the most extraordinary person I have encountered in my life, and because what I feel for her is not the kind of thing that has an expiration date." Clara was quiet for a moment, studying him with those dark, sharp eyes. "She told me you came here from Abilene," she said, "that you came to forget someone." "Yes," he said. "And are you sure," Clara said, with a careful directness that he genuinely respected, "that you are not using what you feel for Susan to replace what you felt before? Because if that is what is happening, I need you to know it, and she needs you to know it." "That is a fair question," he said. "And the honest answer is that what I came here running from was not really a person. It was an expectation I had built that turned out to be made of something that was not as real as I had believed." What I feel for Susan is made of something entirely different. It is made of specific, actual things. The way she argues about a book essay, the way she handles her horses, the way she decided to be alive and building rather than diminished when everything around her was giving her reasons to be diminished. I am not replacing anything. I am finding something I did not previously know existed. Clara looked at him for a long, measuring moment, and then she stood up and said, "All right," which was not an elaborate response but carried in it everything she meant. "Thank you for asking me directly," he said. "I always ask directly," she said. "Susan says it is my worst quality. I think it is my best one." She went back through the gate, and he picked up his maul and split 3 more pieces of wood, before stopping to look out at the evening light on his land and the land to the south, which was Susan's, and feeling the warm, comprehensive rightness of his life settling around him like the specific comfort of a house you have built with your own hands. October proceeded with the urgency of frontier autumn preparation, the pressing work of getting everything battened down and stored and secured before the winter could arrive and find you unprepared. Ezekiel and Susan and Clara worked their 2 claims together through the middle weeks of the month with a communal efficiency that felt natural and domestic and very full. Clara turned out to be an excellent cook, even better than Susan in terms of variety, if not in the fundamental reliability of the results, and she took over the kitchen on several evenings and produced meals that drew Tom Haskett and his wife Mary from 2 claims north with transparent and shameless hunger. Tom declared that Clara was a culinary genius, and Mary elbowed him in the ribs for the enthusiasm of this particular declaration, and Clara laughed with a fullness that was as characteristic of her as her directness, and that brought a warmth into the evenings that Ezekiel found he was grateful for. It was in the last week of October, when the temperature had dropped sharply, and the first hard frost had come and gone in a single night that changed the color of the land permanently to the muted, serious palette of late autumn, that Ezekiel rode into Caldwell Creek and stopped at the jeweler's small display in the back of the general store, where Horace Finch kept a modest collection of rings alongside his surveying equipment and his ledger books, because Horace Finch was a man of practical enterprise. He looked at the rings for a while. Horace came to stand beside him with the knowing quiet of a man who has watched this particular scene play out before and understands that intervention is not required. There was one ring that caught him. It was a simple gold band with a small setting that held a pale green stone, not expensive but genuinely lovely, with the clean, unornamented honesty of something made to last rather than to impress. He picked it up and held it, and it was exactly right. He bought it. He put it in his breast pocket and rode home with it sitting against his heart and thought about what he was going to say. He thought about it for 2 days, which was not procrastination but precision. He was not afraid of asking. He was certain enough about her answer to not be afraid. What he wanted was to ask in a way that was worthy of her, in the way that she was direct and clear and unornamented, in the way that the ring he had chosen was, in the way that the life they had built on neighboring pieces of ground in the Kansas Territory was. He did it on a Thursday afternoon in November with the sky, a clear cold blue above the bluffs, and the air smelling of dried grass and approaching winter. He walked through the gate in the fence line and found her at the side of her house stacking wood against the exterior wall for easy access through the winter, and he helped her stack wood for 20 minutes without saying anything out of the ordinary. And when the last piece was set in place and she straightened and looked at him with the mild satisfaction of a completed task, he turned to face her and took the ring from his pocket. She looked at the ring and then at him, and everything in her face was open and present and completely clear. "I came to Caldwell Creek to forget a woman," he said, "and I found her sister living on the land next door." He held the ring between them. "And I want you to know that the distance between those 2 things is the whole geography of my life from where it was to where I want it to be." Susan looked at him for a long, full, luminous moment and then said, "Yes, Ezekiel, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it on her hand, And then she looked at him and stepped forward, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her for the first time. There, beside the stacked wood in the cold November afternoon, with the bluffs golden in the distance, and the meadowlarks gone south for winter, and the whole wide prairie country extending outward in every direction around them. Clara, who had come around the corner of the house at precisely the wrong and right moment with an armful of kindling, stopped, looked at the two of them, set the kindling carefully against the wall without making any sudden movements, and walked back the way she had come with a smile of such thorough satisfaction that it lasted for the rest of the day and well into the evening. The wedding was planned for spring, which was both practical and right. There was winter to get through first, and getting through a first winter on the territory was itself a kind of ceremony that needed to be honored as such. Clara decided, with the characteristic determination that Ezekiel had come to appreciate genuinely, to stay through the winter rather than return to Missouri, renting a room in town at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Cross, who was glad of the company and the income. Clara was at Susan's claim almost every day, which meant the three of them spent the winter months in a proximity that was domestic and companionable and occasionally chaotic, when the weather kept everyone inside, and Clara's opinions about everything accumulated at velocity. But Ezekiel found, with some surprise, that he genuinely liked Clara Bancroft, in the specific way you like someone who is sharply intelligent and completely honest and reliably interesting, and whose determination, when it was directed at useful ends, produced results that were hard to argue with. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was a hard one, as most territory winters were. The cold came in early and settled in with the permanence of a bad debt. There were weeks when the temperature stayed below freezing day and night, and the snow on the grassland was deep enough to require snowshoes for any movement outside, and the animals needed constant attention, and the water lines needed constant unfreezing, and the firewood consumed itself at a rate that made Ezekiel glad he had spent so much of October and November cutting and stacking it. He came to Susan's claim every single day without exception, which was not difficult since the fence line was between them, and the gate took 30 seconds to reach in any weather. They spent long winter evenings by her fire with Clara present, and sometimes without her, talking and reading and planning the spring, and Ezekiel felt the winter as something rich and enclosed rather than as a deprivation, which was the specific alchemy of having people you love in the same space as the cold and the dark. There was a night in December, a Sunday, when the storm outside was absolute and Clara had stayed at Mrs. Cross's in town rather than attempt the road, and Ezekiel and Susan were alone in her house with the fire and a lamp, and the particular quality of a winter evening that is both shelter and permission, and they talked for hours about everything that was real and important, about family and loss and what they each wanted to build, not just in terms of land and crops and structures, but in terms of a life in its fullest sense. Susan told him about her mother, who had died when she and Clara were children, and about the specific shape of growing up in a house where two girls had had to make a mother of the air between them, and about how her father had been wonderful and insufficient at once, as people often are, and how she had learned that love was something you built from available materials, and that the building was what made it real. She said all of this in her precise, honest way, and he listened with his whole attention and loved her with increasing comprehensiveness as she spoke. He told her about his parents in Ohio and about his father's belief in self-sufficiency and the specific limitation of that belief, that a man who can do everything alone sometimes does not know what he is missing by doing it alone, and about his years moving through the territory, and about Clara Whitmore, all of it. The ring and the hope and the Saturday evening and the 3 days of riding and the trading post where a stranger had told him about Caldwell Creek. He told her all of it cleanly, and she listened with the same whole attention, and when he was done she said, "I am glad you came," with a simplicity that contained everything. He reached across and took her hand on the table, and they sat with the fire and the storm and the lamp. And the winter around them was very cold and they were very warm. January and February tested every claim in the settlement with a series of blizzards that came in from the north with biblical enthusiasm. And the community of Caldwell Creek demonstrated, under this testing, the particular quality that distinguishes a real community from a collection of individuals who happen to occupy the same geography. Neighbors checked on neighbors with the systematic regularity of a duty roster. Supplies were shared. When the Delacroix family lost part of their roof to a January storm, a group of 8 men, including Ezekiel and Tom Haskett, had it rebuilt within 3 days of the weather clearing. When old Mrs. Paulson's horse died of the cold, Susan organized a collection that purchased her a replacement by March. Ezekiel watched Susan organize this collection with the specific admiring recognition of someone watching a person be exactly and entirely themselves. She went from claim to claim on a clear February morning with a specific request and a specific plan, and a clear accounting of what was needed. And she accomplished it entirely without drama or performance, simply as a neighbor doing what was needed because it was needed. And Ezekiel thought that she was going to make this settlement a better place in ways that would be difficult to measure but entirely real. March came in cold but visibly willing to change, and the quality of the light shifted in the way that only spring light shifts on the open prairie, adding a warmth to the angle that was more promise than reality but was entirely credible as promise. The creek was running high with snowmelt, and the first green was pushing up through the dead grass in the low spots where the sun hit longest. Clara announced in the second week of March that she had made a decision. She was going to file her own homestead claim. She said this at Susan's kitchen table with the coffee pot between them and her hands flat on the table in the posture of someone who has thought about something comprehensively and is now simply communicating a conclusion. Susan looked at her with surprise, and a complicated mixture of emotions moving across her usually composed face. Ezekiel said nothing because this was a thing between sisters and he was observant enough to know when to let a thing be. "I want to talk to Mr. Finch," Clara said. "There is a parcel available to the east of Susan's claim beyond the seasonal creek, 160 acres. The soil survey is good. I have the filing fee." "Clara," Susan said, "you are a school teacher." "I was a school teacher," Clara said. "I am also a woman who has spent a winter on the frontier and has decided that this is where she wants to build her life." She looked at Ezekiel briefly and then back at her sister. "I have been watching what you have built here, both of you, and I want to build something too. I am not doing it to stay close to you, although I am not pretending that is irrelevant. I am doing it because I looked out across this land in October when I first arrived, and I felt something that I have not felt before, which is that I could make something here that was entirely mine." Susan looked at her for a long moment and then reached across the table and covered Clara's hands with her own. "Then file the claim," she said. Clara filed the claim. She moved her belongings from Mrs. Cross's boarding house to the land office storage until a shelter could be built, and the spring building season was suddenly twice as full as it had already been. Ezekiel put considerable effort into helping Clara establish her claim in the first weeks of spring, not from obligation, but from the genuine desire to see it done properly and quickly, which was also Susan's desire, and which meant the three of them worked together with a focused communal purpose that felt very right. Tom Haskett came to help and brought 2 of his hired men, and a simple but sturdy one-room structure went up on Clara's claim in 10 days that left her with a proper shelter, 4 walls and a roof, and a door that latched from the inside, which was the foundational requirement. "It is not much," Ezekiel said, looking at it when the last nail was in. "It is exactly much," Clara said, looking at it with an expression that was entirely her own, and that he recognized as the specific satisfaction of someone looking at something they intend to build outward from, which was exactly what it was. The wedding was set for the 12th of April, which was a Saturday, and which fell on a day of completely unreasonable beauty, as though the territory had decided to contribute to the occasion. The sky was the clear, limitless blue of a perfect spring day. The air was warm but with a clean edge, and the grass was deeply, freshly green in a way that was almost theatrical in its perfection. Reverend Caldwell conducted the ceremony at the edge of Susan's claim, on the slight rise above the kitchen garden where you could see both parcels of land stretching away in either direction, Ezekiel's to the north and Susan's to the south, and Clara's new claim to the east. The community of Caldwell Creek came in its entirety, or very nearly, because a wedding in a small settlement is a public occasion of the best kind, a declaration that something permanent is being built and that the community is witness to it. Susan wore a dress of pale blue that she had made herself over the winter with a care that showed in every seam, and she had her hair dressed by Clara into a style that was elegant without being impractical, and she wore the green stone ring on her finger and carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Clara had found along the creek bank that morning, and she walked out from her house in the spring light and Ezekiel, waiting at the slight rise with Reverend Caldwell, saw her and felt something so comprehensive and complete in his chest that he was briefly unable to do anything but look. She came to stand beside him and looked up at him, and what was in her face was clear and warm and entirely real. He took her hand and she held his, and Reverend Caldwell began to speak. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, and also, in both their cases, deeply meant. When Ezekiel said that he would honor and cherish her in all circumstances, he said it with the specific authority of someone who has examined the claim carefully and knows exactly what he is signing. When Susan said the same, she said it with the direct, unornamented honesty that was the most characteristically herself thing about her, which meant it was worth more than gold. Tom Haskett cried. He denied this afterward with great conviction. No one believed him. Clara stood beside Susan throughout and looked at the two of them with an expression that was happy and warm, and contained within it a private quality that Ezekiel noted but did not address, because Clara was 21 and new to the territory and building something of her own, and her story was still very much in front of her, and it was not his business to manage it. The wedding supper was held in the cleared ground between the two claims, with tables carried out from both houses and food contributed by what felt like the entire population of the settlement. And it went on until the stars were fully out, and the fire was a comfortable collection of coals, and people were sitting in small groups in the firelight, talking with the specific ease of a community that has been through a winter together and come out on the other side of it. Ezekiel sat with Susan's hand in his and looked at the fire and the faces of the people around it. Tom Haskett's big laugh carrying across the gathering, the Delacroix children asleep in a heap on a blanket, Clara talking with animation to Mrs. Cross about something that was clearly important to both of them, Reverend Caldwell sitting quietly on the edge of things with the satisfied expression of a man who has done good work. And he felt the very precise and particular feeling of being exactly where he belonged. He turned to Susan, and she was already looking at him with those hazel eyes that had been the first thing he had really seen when he came to this land, and she said quietly, "Are you happy?" "Profoundly," he said. "You?" "Yes," she said, with the specific economy of a person who uses the word completely. "Yes, profoundly." He brought his land fully to production through the spring and summer of 1879. And Susan's claim continued to develop in parallel, and by the autumn they had between them a productive and sustainable operation that would serve them through many seasons ahead. They combined the two parcels functionally, while keeping them legally separate in the way that the land office allowed, and the fence line between them became more symbolic than practical, a reminder of where they had each started rather than a division of where they were. Susan moved into Ezekiel's house because it was the larger of the two, and they spent 3 weeks in the autumn fitting it out as a proper shared home, adding a kitchen extension that gave Susan the working space she needed, and framing a second room that might, at some point, be a child's room. They did this work together with the same natural, coordinated competence they brought to all shared work, which by now was deep and unthinking, and efficient in the way that two people who have been paying close attention to each other for a long time are always efficient together. Clara's claim to the East was progressing well. She had taken on a hired hand for the heavier work, a young man from one of the newer claims named Davis Wheeler, who was 23 and straightforward in his manner, and who had come to the territory from Tennessee with skills that were genuinely useful and an earnestness that Clara had initially found slightly exasperating, and then gradually, over the course of a summer, found increasingly compelling. Ezekiel watched this development with the comfortable amusement of someone who recognizes a process he himself has recently completed, and said nothing because it was not his to say, and Susan watched it with the careful attention of an older sister, and said nothing for the same reason, but had opinions about it that she shared with Ezekiel in the evenings with a precision and warmth that made him laugh and agree with her simultaneously. Davis Wheeler came to ask Ezekiel's opinion about Clara in September, because Davis was a young man who understood that the proper approach to the situation involved some form of consultation with the person who was closest to family that Clara had in the territory. He came to the claim on a Sunday afternoon and asked the question directly and with a visible nervousness that spoke well of him. And Ezekiel told him that Clara Bancroft was as clear-eyed and honest and capable a person as he had encountered, and that if Davis's intentions were genuine and serious then, he had no objection whatsoever, and that if they were not then the conversation would take a very different tone. Davis's intentions were genuine and serious, which was evident from every aspect of his manner, and he went to Clara's claim and said what he had to say in the direct way that Clara invariably demanded, and Clara listened to him with her flat-handed, attentive posture, and then said yes, with a smile that her sister would have recognized completely. The settlement of Caldwell Creek grew through 1879 and into the next decade, with the steady, incremental growth of a place that has found its own character and is building outward from it. New settlers arrived and were absorbed and contributed, and the town itself acquired a proper church, a schoolhouse, a doctor's office, and 2 more general stores, and the Red Ace got a piano that was properly in tune, which Gus the bartender regarded as an aesthetic improvement, and several of the regulars regarded as a loss of character. In the January of 1880, Susan told Ezekiel on a Sunday morning by the fire with a quiet and radiant calm that she was expecting their first child. He took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long time, and she looked back at him with those eyes that he had been looking into for nearly 2 years now, and that still produced in him the same quality of complete and unguarded feeling they had produced when he first really saw them at the fence line in the morning light of his first full day on the claim. "Are you happy?" she asked him, with the specific echo of their wedding night question that was between them like a private code. "Profoundly," he said, and kissed her, and the fire was warm and the winter was outside and the spring was coming. Their son was born in September of 1880, a large and emphatic child who arrived in the world with a good deal of energy and a healthy set of lungs, and a quality of decisive engagement with his surroundings that Ezekiel recognized from his first glimpse of him as belonging entirely to his mother. They named him Robert after Susan's father, which was Susan's idea, and which seemed to Ezekiel exactly right, a circle closed and a beginning honored at once. Clara came to the birth, staying at the house for the week before and after in the particular capacity of someone who is simultaneously a sister and a capable practical presence, and she held her nephew on the day he was born with an expression of profound wonder that Ezekiel had not previously seen on her face, and which moved him considerably. Davis Wheeler had proposed to Clara in November of the previous year, and Clara had accepted, and they had been planning a spring wedding, which gave the autumn of 1880 a quality of overlapping joy that was almost overabundant in its richness. Clara was happy in the specific, particular way that Susan had predicted she would be when she found the right thing, fully and without reservation, with the same comprehensive quality she brought to everything else. Their wedding in May of 1881 was a smaller affair than Ezekiel, and Susan's had been, at Clara's preference, held in the new church on a bright spring morning with the whole settlement present because there was no stopping it. Davis Wheeler stood at the altar with an expression of such earnest and complete happiness that even Tom Haskett, who was not prone to sentiment, remarked afterward that it had been one of the better things he had witnessed in his 40 years of life. The years that followed in Caldwell Creek were full years, in every sense of the word, full of work and weather and the specific drama of frontier seasons, full of the community business that comes with living among people who have staked real claims in a real place and who are consequently invested in it in ways that go deep. Full of children, eventually, as Robert was joined by a younger sister they called Me, and then another boy they called Thomas after Tom Haskett, who wept again at the naming and denied it again with the same conviction, and was believed no better. Ezekiel and Susan's land grew and developed through the decade, the original claims becoming something that could be described, by the later years of the 1880s, as a proper ranch, with cattle added to the agricultural operation, and a barn that was now genuinely impressive, and horses that Susan managed with the expertise of someone who had been working with horses in serious conditions for long enough to have made herself an authority. Susan became one of the foundational figures of the Caldwell Creek community in the quiet, comprehensive way of people who lead not by declaring themselves leaders, but by simply doing the things that need doing at the level of quality that sets the standard. She was on the first school board when the schoolhouse was built, and contributed to the organization of the community lending library when that was established, and was the first person that new settlers on neighboring claims sought out because word had spread, with the organic efficiency of genuinely useful information, that Susan Barnett knew the territory and would tell you what you needed to know without condescension, and without leaving anything important out. Clara and Davis established their own thriving claim to the east, and Clara's original one-room shelter had expanded by 1885 into a proper house with a kitchen garden that was, Susan observed with entirely loving exasperation, even better organized than her own. Clara taught at the Caldwell Creek schoolhouse for 2 years when the first teacher left and proved, as she proved at most things she applied herself to be exceptionally good at it. On an October evening in 1887, Ezekiel was sitting on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands in the spring of 1878, the house that had grown and added to itself over 9 years into something solid and generous and deeply lived in, with the lamp behind him making a warm rectangle of light on the porch boards and the autumn stars coming out one by one above the limestone bluffs. He could hear Susan inside putting Robert and Me to bed, the low murmur of her voice reading to them in the way she did every evening, the specific cadence of a story being told, and Thomas was asleep in his crib in the second bedroom, and the house was full of the breathing of 4 people he loved more than the sum of any previous understanding he had had of what love was capable of being. He thought about the Tuesday morning in April of 1878, when he had ridden into this settlement with $32 and a bedroll, and the very specific intention of burying himself deep enough in hard work and open land to stop feeling the absence of something that, he could now see clearly, had never actually been the thing he was looking for. He thought about what Horace Finch had said, almost incidentally, about the young woman on the claim to the south. He thought about the gate in the fence line and the morning light, and the first time he had really looked at Susan Bancroft's face. He thought about the essay on self-reliance and its limits that she had lent him on a stormy April night, and that was still, 9 years later, on the shelf above his fireplace, a little worn at the spine now from having been read multiple times by both of them. He thought about the specific and extraordinary distance between arriving somewhere to forget and finding, in the place you arrived, the thing you had not known you were looking for, the thing that made forgetting not only possible but irrelevant, because the past was simply the road that had brought you here, and the here was everything. The door opened behind him and Susan came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and sat in the chair beside his and put her feet up on the porch rail the way she always did in the evenings, and the lamplight caught the green stone in her ring and the stars were coming out fully now above the bluffs and the whole wide Kansas night was spread out before them. "They are asleep," she said. "All 3 of them. Thomas too." Finally, she drank her coffee and looked out at the dark land. "Clara came by this afternoon while you were at the north fence. She is expecting again." "That is good news," he said. "She is very happy," Susan said, with the warm, particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched her younger sister find the thing that was right for her. They were quiet for a while, in the companionable, complete silence of 2 people who have been talking to each other for 9 years and have run out of nothing but have also found that silence between them is its own language. "Ezekiel," she said after a while. "Yes." She turned her head and looked at him with those hazel eyes that were 32 years old now and wiser and fuller and more beautiful than they had been when he first saw them at a fence line in the early morning light of the spring of 1878. "Are you happy?" she asked as she had asked him before on their wedding night, on the night Robert was born, on various ordinary evenings when the question was its own answer. He looked at her face, at the woman he had built a life with, at the land around them that they had both brought from raw ground to something real, at the house full of children who were theirs, at the stars above the limestone bluffs of the Kansas Territory, and felt the full weight and the full warmth of everything he had found when he came here to forget. "Profoundly," he said. She smiled, the full smile that changed the whole architecture of her face, the one he had been watching for 9 years and which still, every single time, did something to him that he could not describe and would not have wanted to anyway because some things are better carried than translated. She turned back to the stars and he looked at her, and then at the stars and the October night settled around them, warm and full and completely, entirely closed. The settlement of Caldwell Creek grew in the years that followed into a proper town, with a newspaper and a bank and a courthouse, and all the infrastructure of a civilization taking root in ground that had been open grassland not 20 years before. Ezekiel and Susan's ranch became one of the established operations in the county, known for the quality of its cattle and the management of its land and the character of the people running it. Robert, when he was old enough, worked the land beside his father with a seriousness and a natural aptitude that made Ezekiel's chest tighten with pride in the quiet, inarticulate way that fathers experience pride in their sons. Me had her mother's directness and her Aunt Clara's velocity, and was already at the age of 7 the most organized person in the house. Thomas was sunny and loud, and found something genuinely funny in most situations, which Ezekiel recognized from Tom Haskett and suspected would serve Thomas well throughout his life. Tom Haskett himself remained 2 claims to the north, his laugh still carrying across the grassland, his wife Mary a fixture of the community and a close friend of Susan's. The Delacroix family to the west had expanded their claim, and their children were growing into substantial frontier citizens. Reverend Caldwell had retired from active ministry, but still attended every Sunday service and still shook hands with a warmth that communicated everything. Clara and Davis Wheeler's claim to the east flourished. Clara's determination, directed fully at the building of a homestead and a life, proved exactly as effective as it had suggested it would be in every other context it had been applied to. They had 3 children by the end of the decade, and the 2 families, Susan and Ezekiel's and Clara and Davis's, formed between them the kind of extended family unit that the territory both required, and at its best produced, the overlapping of claims and help and meals and children and history that made a settlement into a home. On a spring morning in 1889, when the territory was becoming a state, and the land office was busy with the formal documentation of what had already been built by people like the Barnetts and the Wheelers over the preceding decade, Ezekiel rode the perimeter of his land in the early light as he had ridden it on his very first morning on the claim, 11 years before. The land was unrecognizable from what it had been then, not in its essential character, but in everything that had been added to it. The fences and the fields and the barn and the windmill and the cattle and the kitchen garden and the root cellar and the chicken house, and the fruit trees that Susan had planted 4 years ago that were now actually bearing fruit, and the house itself, expanded and solid and full. He rode to the southern fence line and looked at Susan's original claim, which was his too now, and thought about the gate that was still there, still functional, never removed, because there was no reason to remove something that still meant something even if what it meant had changed from a passage between two separate pieces of ground to the mark of where two lives had met. He thought about a man he had been in the winter of 1877 in Abilene, polishing his boots in front of a mirror and believing he understood what he wanted. He thought about the 3 days of riding in the dark and the trading post, and the stranger who had mentioned Caldwell Creek with the casual generosity of someone who could not have known what they were setting in motion. He thought about the gate and the morning light and the fence post and the hazel eyes. He was 41 years old, and he was sitting on a horse on his own land in a place that was about to become a state, and his wife was in their house making breakfast and their children were waking up to do the same, and his sister-in-law was on the next claim, and the spring was coming in full and green and completely certain, and the life that he had built from the raw material of loss and accident and open ground was whole and finished and ongoing at once, the way the best lives are. He turned his horse toward the house. Susan was on the porch with coffee, watching him come across the field, and she raised her cup in a small greeting, and the morning light was on her face, and the spring was everywhere around them, and everything was exactly as it should be. He came to the porch, and she handed him his coffee, and he stood beside her looking out at the land, and she stood beside him and the story of how he had come here to forget a woman, and found her sister living on the land next door was not a story about forgetting at all. He understood finally, completely, with the clarity of 11 years of accumulated truth. It was a story about arriving, about the specific mercy of ending up exactly where you were supposed to be, by the longest and least expected route, and knowing it when you got there. The grass was green all the way to the bluffs, and the sky was the particular blue of a perfect spring morning in Kansas, and the coffee was hot, and Susan's shoulder was warm against his arm, and the children were inside, and the land was theirs, and the life they had built together on it was real and permanent and full of everything that mattered. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. The meadowlarks had come back from the south. Spring was here. Everything was home.